Hello everyone, welcome back to Joan of Arc. Our last hopes of rescue fail. Joan had been adjudged guilty of heresy, sorcery, and all other terrible crimes set forth in the 12 Articles. And her life was in Cushan's hands at last. He could send her to the stake at once. His work was finished now. You think? He was satisfied? Not at all. What would his archbishopric be worth if the people should get the idea into their heads that this faction of interested priests, slaving under the English lash, had wrongly condemned and burned Joan of Arc, deliverer of France? That would be to make of her a holy martyr. Then her spirit would rise from her body's ashes, a thousandfold reinforced, and sweep the English domination into the sea, and Cushan along with it. No, the victory was not complete yet. Joan's guilt must be established by evidence which would satisfy the people. There was no evidence to be found. There was only one person in the world who could furnish it, Joan of Arc herself. She must condemn herself, and in public at least she must seem to do it. But how was this to be managed? Weeks had been spent already in trying to get her to surrender, time wholly wasted. What was to persuade her now? Torture had been threatened. The fire had been threatened. What was left? Illness and deadly fatigue, and the sight of the fire, the presence of fire, that was left. Now that was a shrewd thought. She was but a girl after all, and under illness and exhaustion subject to a girl's weaknesses. Yes, it was shrewdly thought. She had tacitly said herself that under the bitter pains of the rack they would be able to extort a false confession from her. It was a hint worth remembering, and it was remembered. She had furnished another hint at the same time, that as soon as the pains were gone, they would that she would retract her confession. That hint was also remembered. She had herself taught them what to do, you see. First, they must wear out her strength, then frighten her with fire. Second, while the fright was on her, she must be made to sign a paper. But she would demand a reading of the paper. They could not venture to refuse this, with the public there to hear. Suppose that during the reading her courage should return, and would refuse to sign. Very well. Even that difficulty could be got over. They could read a short paper of no importance, then slip a long and deadly one in its place and trick her into signing that. Yet there was still one other difficulty. If they made her seem to abjure, that would free her from the death penalty. They could keep her in prison of the church, but they could not kill her. That would not answer. For only a death it would content the English. Alive she was in terror, in a prison or out of it. She had escaped from prisons already, two actually. But even that difficulty could not be managed. Cushan would make promises to her. In return she would promise to leave off the male dress. He would violate these promises, and that would so situate her that she would not be able to keep hers. A lapse would condemn her to the stake, and the stake would be ready. Through the several moves, there was nothing to do but to make them, each in its order. And the game was won. One might also name the day that the betrayed girl, the most innocent creature in France and the noblest, would go to a pitiful death. The world knows now that Cushan's plan was as I have sketched it to you, but the world didn't know it at that time. There were sufficient indications that Warwick and all the other English chiefs, except the highest one, the Cardinal of Winchester, were not to let into the secret. Also that only Loiseleur and Beaupierre on the French side. I knew the scheme. Sometimes I have doubted if even Loiseleur and Beaupierre knew the whole of it at first. However, if they did, it was these two. It is usual to let the condemned pass their night in peace, the last one at least, but this grace was denied to poor Joan, if one may credit the rumours of the time. Loiseleur was smuggled into her presence, and in the character of a priest, friend, and secret partisan of France and hater of England, he spent some hours in beseeching her to do the only right thing, the righteous thing, submit to the church as a good Christian should, and that then she would straightway get out of the clutches of his dreaded English and be transferred to the church's prison, where she would be honourably used, and have women about her for jailers. He knew where to touch her. He knew how odious to her was the presence of her rough and profane English guards. He knew that her voice had vaguely promised something which she interpreted to be escape, rescue, release of some sort, and the chance to burst upon France once more and victoriously complete the great work which she had been commissioned of heaven to do. Also, there was the other thing. If a failing body could be further weakened by loss of rest and sleep now, a tired mind would be dazed and drowsy on the morrow, and in ill condition to stand out against persecutions, persuasions, threats, and the sight of the stake, and also be purblind to traps and snares, which it would be swifter to detect when it's in normal state. I do not need to tell you that there was no rest for me that night, nor for Noel. We went to the main gate of the city before nightfall with a hope in our minds, based upon the vague prophecy of Joan's voices, which seemed to promise a rescue by force at the last moment. The immense news had flown swiftly far and wide that Joan of Arc was condemned, and would be sentenced and burned alive on the morrow. And so crowds of people were flowing in at the gate, and other crowds were being refused admission by the soldiery. These people, who brought doubtful passers on at all. We scanned these crowds eagerly, but there was nothing about them to indicate that they were old war comrades in disguise. And certainly there was no familiar faces among them. And so when the gate was closed at last, we turned away grieved and more disappointed than we cared to admit, either in speech or thought. The streets were surging tides of excited men. It was difficult to make one's way. Towards midnight, our aimless tramp brought us to the neighbourhood of the beautiful church of Saint Ouen, and there all the bustle and work. The square was a wilderness of torches and people, and through a guarded passage dividing the pack, labourers were carrying planks and timbers, and disappearing with them through the gate of the churchyard. We asked what was going forward. The answer was, "Scaffolds and the stake. Don't you know that the French witch is to be burned in the morning?" Then we went away. We had no heart for that place. At dawn we were at the city gate, this time with a hope which our weary bodies and fevered minds magnified into a large probability. We had a report that the abbot of Jumiges with all his monks was coming to witness the burning. Our desire, abetted by our imagination, turned those 900 monks into Joan's old compagnons, and their abbot into La Haya and the bastard, or the Alacon, and we watched them filing unchallenged, the multitude respectfully dividing and uncovering while they passed, with our hearts in our throats and our eyes swimming with tears of joy and pride and exultation, and we tried to catch glimpses of their faces under the cowls, and were prepared to give signal to any recognised face that were Joan's men, and ready, eager to kill and be killed in the good cause. How foolish we were. But we were young, you know, and youth hopeth all things, believeth all things. In the morning, I was at my official post. It was on a platform raised the height of man in the churchyard, under the eaves of Saint Ouen. On this same platform was a crowd of priests and important citizens and several lawyers. Abreast it, with a small space between, was another, larger platform, handsomely canopied against sun and rain and richly carpeted. Also, it was furnished with comfortable chairs, and with two, which were more sumptuous than the others, and raised above the general level. One of these two men occupied by the Prince of the Royal Blood of England, His Eminence the Cardinal of Winchester, the other by Couchon, Bishop of Beauvais. In the rest of the chairs sat 3 bishops, the vice-inquisitor, 8 abbots, and the 62 friars and lawyers, who had sat at Joan's judges in her late trials. 20 steps in front of the platforms was a table-top pyramid of stone, built up in retreating courses, thus forming steps. One of these rose that grisly thing, the stake. About the stake, bundles of faggots and firewood were piled. On the ground at the base of the pyramid stood 3 crimson figures, the executioner's assistants. At their feet lay what had been a goodly heap of brands, but was now a smokeless nest of ruddy coals. A foot or two from this was a supplemental supply of wood and faggots, compacted into a pile shoulder high and containing much as 6 pack horse loads. Think of that. We seem so delicately made, so destructible, so insubstantial, yet it's easier to reduce a granite statue to ashes than it is to do that with a man's body. The sight of the stake sent physical pains tingling down the nerves of my body, and yet, turn as I would, my eyes would keep coming back to it. Such fascination has the gruesome and terrible for us. The space occupied by the platforms and the stake was kept open by the wall of English soldiery, standing elbow to elbow, erect and stalwart figures, fine and sightly in their polished steel, while from behind them on every hand stretched far away a level plain of human heads, and there was no window, no housetop within view, howsoever distant, but was black with patches and masses of people. There was no noise, no stir. It was as if the world was dead. The impressiveness of this silence and solemnity was deepened by a leaden twilight, for the sky was hidden by the pale of low-hanging storm clouds, and above the remote horizon faint winkings of heat, lightning played, and now and then one caught the dull mutterings and complainings of distant thunder. At last the stillness was broken. From beyond the square rose an indistinct sound, but familiar chord, crisp phrases of command. Next I saw the plain of heads dividing, and the steady swing of marching hosts was glimpsed between. My heart leaped for a moment. Was it Lahair and his hellions? No, that was not their gate. No, it was a prisoner and her escort. It was Joan of Arc under guard. That was coming. My spirit sank as low as they had been before. Weak as she was, they made her walk. They would increase her weakness all they could. The distance was not great. It was but a few hundred yards. But short as it was heavy, tax upon one who had been lying chained in one spot for months, and whose feet had lost their powers from inaction. Yes, and for a year Joan had known only the cool damps of a dungeon, and now she was dragging herself through the sultry summer heat, this airless and suffocating void. And she entered the gate, drooping with enthusiasm. There was that creature, Lord Silil, at her side, with his head bent to her ear. We knew afterward that he had been with her again this morning in the prison, wearying her with his persuasions and enticing her with false promises, and that he was now still at the same work at the gate, imploring her to yield everything that would be required of her, and assuring her that if she would do this, all would be well with her. She would be rid of the dreaded English and find safety in the powerful shelter and protection of the church. A miserable man, stony-hearted man. The moment Joan was seated on the platform, she closed her eyes and allowed her chin to fall, and so sat, with her hands nestling in her lap, indifferent to everything, caring for nothing but rest. And she was so white again, white as alabaster. How the faces of packed mass of humanity lightened up with interest, and with what intensity all eyes gazed upon this fragile girl, and how natural it was for those people realised that, at last, they were looking upon the person whom they had so long hungered to see, a person whose name and fame filled all Europe, and made all other names and all other renowns insignificant by comparisons. Joan of Arc, the wonder of the time, and destined to be the wonder of all times. And I could read as by print, in their marvelling countenances, the words that were drifting through their minds. Can it be true? Is it believable? That is this little creature, this girl, this child with the good face, the sweet face, the beautiful face, the dear and bonny face has carried fortresses by storm, charged the head of victorious armies, blown the might of the English out of the path with a breath, and fought a long campaign solitary and alone against the massed brains and learning of France, and had won it if the flight had been fair. Evidently Couchon had grown afraid of Manchon because of his pretty apparent leanings towards Joan, for another recorder was in the chief place here, which left my master and me nothing to do but sit idle and look on. Well, I suppose that everything had to be done which could be thought of to tire Joan's body and mind. But it was a mistake. One more device had been invented. This was to preach a long sermon to her in that oppressive heat. When the preacher began, she cast up one distressed and disappointed look, then dropped her head again. The preacher was Guillaume Erard, an oratorical celebrity. He got his text from the 12 Lies. He emptied upon Joan all the calamities in detail that had been bottled up in the mass of venom, and called her all the brutal names that the 12 were labelled with, working himself into a whirlwind of fury as he went on. But his labours were wasted. She seemed lost in dreams. She made no sign. She did not seem to hear. At last he launched his apostrophe. O France, how hast thou been abused? Thou hast always been the home of Christianity. But now Charles, who calls himself thy king and governor, endorses like the heretic and schismatic that he is. The words and deeds are worthless and infamous, woman. Joan raised her head, and her eyes began to burn and flash. The preacher turned to her. It is you, Joan, that I speak, and I tell you that your king is a schismatic and a heretic. Ah, he might abuse her to his heart's content. She could endure that. But to a dying moment she could never hear impatience word against that ingrate, the treacherous dog our king, whose proper place was here, at this moment, sword in hand, yes, routing these reptiles and saving this most noble servant that the king had had in the world, and he would have been there if it had not been what I had called him. He clearly was. Joan's loyal soul was outraged, and she turned upon the preacher and flung out a few words with a spirit which the crowd recognised as being in accordance with Joan of Arc traditions. By my faith, sir, I make bold to say and swear on pain of death that he is the most noble Christian of all Christians, and the best lover of faith and the church. There was an explosion of applause from the crowd, which angered the preacher, for he had been aching long to hear an expression like this, and now that it was come at last, it had fallen to the wrong person. He had done all the work. The other had carried off all the spoil. He stamped his foot and shouted to the sheriff, "Make her shut up!" That made the crowd laugh. A mob had small respect for a grown man who has to call on a sheriff to protect him from a sick girl. Joan had damaged the preacher's cause, more with one sentence than he had helped with 100. So he was much put out and had trouble to get a good start again, but he needn't have bothered. There was no occasion. It was mainly an English-feeling mob. It had obeyed a law of our nature, an irresistible law to enjoy and applaud a spirited and promptly delivered retort, no matter who makes it. The mob was with the preacher. It had been beguiled for a moment, but only that. It would soon return. It was there to see the girl burnt, and that it got the satisfaction without too much delay would be content. Presently the preacher formally summoned Joan to submit to the church. He made the demand with confidence, for he had gotten the idea from Loslem and Pierre that she was worn to the bone, exhausted, and would not be able to put forth any more resistance, and indeed, to look at her, it seemed that they must be right. Nevertheless, she made one more effort to hold her ground and said wearily, "As to that matter, I have answered my judges before. I have told them to report all that I have said and done to our Holy Father, the Pope, to whom, and to God first, I appeal." Again, out of her native wisdom, she had brought those words of tremendous import, but was ignorant of their value. But they could have availed her nothing in any case now, with the stake there and these thousands of enemies about her. Yet they made every churchman turn bleach, and the preacher changed the subject in all haste. Well might those criminals blench, for Joan's appeal of her case to the Pope stripped Couchon at once of jurisdiction over it, and annulled all that he had done and his judges had already done in the matter, and all that they should do in it henceforth. Joan went on presently to reiterate, after some further talk, that she had acted by command of God in her deeds and utterances, Then, when an attempt was made to implicate the king and friends of hers and his, she stopped that. She said, I charge my deeds and words upon no one, neither upon my king nor any other. If there is any fault in them, I am responsible and no other. She was asked if she would not recant those of her words and deeds which had been pronounced evil by the judges. Her answer made confusion and damage again. I submit them to God and the Pope. The Pope once more. It was very embarrassing. Here was a person who was asked to submit her case to the church, and who frankly consents offers to submit it to the very head of it. What more can anyone require? How was one to answer such a formidably unanswerable answer as that? The worried judges put their heads together and whispered and planned and discussed. Then they brought forth this sufficiently shambling conclusion, but it was the best they could do. In so close a place, they said to the Pope, was so far away, and it was not necessary to go to him anyway, because the present judges had sufficient power and authority to deal with the present case, and were in effect the church to that extent. At another time, they could have smiled at this conceit, but not now. They were not comfortable enough now. The mob was getting impatient. It was beginning to put on threatening aspect. It was tired of standing, tired of the scorching heat, and the thunder was coming nearer, and the lightning was flashing brighter. It was necessary to hurry this matter to a close. Eric showed Joan a written form, which had been prepared and made already beforehand, and asked her to sign it. Abjure. What is abjure? She did not know the word. It was explained to her by Monsieur that she tried to understand, but she was breaking under exhaustion, and she could not gather the meaning. It was all a jumble and confusion of strange words. In her despair, she sent out this beseeching cry, I appeal to the Church universal whether I ought to abjure or not. Erard exclaimed, You shall abjure instantly, or instantly be burnt. She glanced up at those awful words, and for the first time she saw the stake and the mass of red coals, redder and angrier than ever now, under the constantly deepening storm gloom. She gasped and staggered up out of her seat, muttering and mumbling incoherently, and gazed vacantly upon the people and the scene about her, like one who is dazed, or thinks she's dreaming, and does not know where she is. The priests crowded about her, imploring her to sign the paper. There were many voices beseeching and urging her at once. There was great turmoil and shouting and excitement among the populace everywhere. Sign, sign, from the priest. Sign, sign, and be saved. And Leslie was urging her at her ear. Do as I have told you to do. Do not destroy yourself. Joan said plantedly to these people, Ah, you do not know well to seduce me. The judges joined their voices to the others. Yes, even the iron in their hearts melted. And they said, Oh, Joan, we pity you so. Take back what you have said, or we must deliver you up in punishment. And now there was another voice. It was from another platform. Pealing solemnly above the din, Couchon's reading the sentence of death. Joan's strength was all spent. She stood looking about her in a bewildered way a moment. Then slowly she sank to her knees, bowed her head, and said, I submit. They gave her no time to reconsider. They knew the peril of that. The moment the words were out of her mouth, Monsieur was reading to her the abjuration, and she was repeating the words after him mechanically, unconsciously and smiling, for her wandering mind was far away in some happier world. Then this short paper of 6 lines was slipped aside, and a long one of many pages was smuggled into it in its place. And she, nothing, put a mark on it, saying, in pathetic apology, that she did not know how to write, but as Secretary of the King of England was there to take care of that defect. He guided her hand with his own, and he wrote her name, Johanna. The great crime was accomplished. She'd signed what? She did not know, but the others knew. She had signed a paper confessing herself a sorceress, a dealer with devils, a liar, a blasphemous of God and his angels, a lover of blood, a promoter of sedition, cruel, wicked, commissioned, sainted, and this signature of hers bound her to resume the dress of a woman. There were other promises, but that one would answer without the others, and that one could be made to destroy her. Lucilla pressed forward and praised her for having done such a good day's work, but she was still dreamy. She hardly heard. Then Cauchon pronounced the words which dissolved the excommunication and restored her to her beloved church, with all dear privileges of worship. She heard that. You could see it. The deep gratitude that rose in her face and transfigured with joy. But how transient was that happiness for Cauchon? Without a tremor of pity in his voice, added these crushing words, and that she may repent of her crimes and repeat them no more, she is sentenced to perpetual imprisonment with the bread of affliction and the water of anguish. Perpetual imprisonment. She never dreamed of that. Such a thing had never been hinted to her by Lucilla, or by any other. Lucilla distinctly said and promised that all would be well with her, and the very last words spoken to her by Erard on that very platform when he was urging her to abjure was a straight, unqualified promise that if she would do it, she would go free from captivity. She stood stunned and speechless a moment. Then she remembered, with such solacement as a thought could furnish, that, by another clear promise made by Cauchon himself, she would at least be the church's captive, and have women about her in a place of brutal foreign soldiery. So she turned to the body of priests and said, with a sad resignation, "Now, you men of the church, take me to your prison, and leave me no longer in the hands of the English." And she gathered up her chains and prepared to move. But alas, now was these shameful words from Cauchon, and with them a mocking laugh. Take her to the prison whence she came. Poor abused girl. She stood dumb, smitten, paralysed. It was pitiful to see. She'd been beguiled, lied to, betrayed. She saw it all now. The rumbling of the drum broke upon the stillness, and for just one moment she thought of the glorious deliverance promised by the voices. I read it in the rapture that lit her face when she saw what it was, her prison escort, and the light faded, never to be revived again. And now her head began a piteous rocking motion, swaying slowly this way and that, as in the way when one is suffering inwardable pain, or when one's heart is broken. Then drearily she went from us, with her face in her hands, and sobbing bitterly. So you see, they are liars, they are cowards, they lie, they deceive, and they have done a very, very horrible thing. Thank you for listening to this part, and many blessings.